Last time on Kerbal Space Program. Val has of course done this with absolutely no supervision, so we'll see how this goes. Maybe this will all just flip over because she didn't consider aerodynamics in the slightest while designing the spacecraft. Of course, these parachutes are way overkill because I set them up for appropriate weight for the entire stack. Because I am stupid. So let's just cut ahead to the part where we're landing this thing. And of course, Val is our pilot, and we roll her out to the runway for Kerbin's very first aircraft flight. The first thing Valentina does is, of course, collect science. We don't really want to collect the mystery goo right now, seeing as it's one use, but we can collect everything else and carefully board the plane back again. And of course, the second thing to notice is that we seem to have forgotten a transmitter, I think. Yeah, so that's unfortunate. We can only collect science once from there. Maybe I should fix that. But anyway, having that done, Valentina takes a good look at the spacecraft, does her control checks, and immediately realizes that there's only one aileron, seeing as somebody is really stupid. So of course, she stops the plane and rolls it back into the hangar to be fixed. Of course, if you want to see how it would work if she hadn't done that, well, it would go something like this.
Bank angle, bank angle. Bank angle, bank angle.
Yes, somehow it appears that Valentina actually does survive this. That seems improbable, but hey, who can defy the will of the Kerbals? More importantly, the physics engine of Unity. Anyway, now back on the runway, featuring such improvements as a second aileron and a functional, if unusual, system to brake on the ground so that the plane doesn't just roll everywhere, Valentina is once again ready to begin her mission. With the brakes engaged, she enables the stability assist system and then allows the Klimovs to get a little bit started before turning the brakes off. That one landing gear isn't actually strong enough to hold us on the ground, even though the Klimov is kind of underpowered for this jet, but it helps to have the engine run a little bit because jet engines do need time to spool up. And again, because the Klimov is severely underpowered for this application, we need to actually use the T-45 to help us get off the ground. And that's going to come at the very end of the runway. There's a little bit of a drop-off, and right before we reach it, we use the T-45 to help us gain speed and pull into a climb.
Gear up. Gear up.
And then the GPWS yells at us to put the gear up, even though these are not retractable. The GPWS is a new system introduced for aviation safety in the wake of, the new initiative to stop losing Kerbonauts. It will warn Valentina when things happen like, say, she's going too fast on approach to the runway, or she's about to crash into a mountain, which are considered important. It also provides stall warnings and a variety of other things, which I'm sure we'll encounter as time goes on. Anyway, now that we are at the appropriate altitude and speed, we can test the Klimov. And we see that we have been paid for it. Quite handsomely, I might add. Now, I do have a mod installed to enable fly-by-wire. However, I am not actually using it, even though it could be pretty nice right now to be able to set a cruise heading, to have this thing turn, or to hold an altitude. I will likely start to use it later, but for now, at least early, perhaps even only for the first flight of this aircraft to prove that I can, I'm going to leave that alone. And like I said, the plan here is to get as high as we can on the Klimovs, and then engage the T-45 to try to get us high enough to test the radial chute. It would be kind of nice if we could also test the T-45 for this contract. I severely doubt that we have the fuel for that, though. Because even though we have a pretty good amount of delta V for the jet engines, I believe the number is 3 kilometers per second, which is actually fairly close to the amount you need for orbit on Kerbal. The Klimov is just not a high enough performance engine to get us to an altitude where the limited amount of fuel we have for the T-45 can get us anywhere. It's kind of in a bad state because the amount of fuel that we took isn't enough to get us very far on the T-45, but it's heavy enough that the Klimovs are really rather weak, especially when we have all of these landing gear and all of this drag and all sorts of different stuff holding the plane down. So this plane kind of needs to have this whole middle fuselage replaced with something that is actually lighter and maybe provides higher performance. But seeing as how we're trying to get higher than I think I can get on jet engines alone right now, this is going to have to do. Now we're actually getting pretty high up on the Klimovs, just because of the sedate rate of climb. We're going to start losing performance as we go up higher, mainly because we can't feed as much air into the engine, and air is very important for air-breathing engines. For reference, the altitude that we're trying to get to, 11 kilometers, is actually fairly close to the cruising altitude of a passenger jet. "11 kilometers is roughly equal to 36,100 feet, and passenger jets tend to cruise at altitudes around 33,000 feet. I believe the Boeing 737, which is an excellent example of an aircraft, seeing as how it is, I believe, still the most common passenger jet, It flies at an altitude of up to 41,000 feet, I believe, but most of the time it doesn't quite go that high. While jet engines are more performant at higher altitudes, mostly because, as you can see, the fuel flow goes down, meaning that they consume less fuel even though they're producing less thrust. The effect of less fuel consumption happens faster. Okay, so I kind of explained this pretty poorly in the actual recording that I took of the game quite a long time ago, so I'm going to do something better. So here I am in a different save that I've got. This is a real progression 0 save, so we are actually on Earth right now, looking at Cape Canaveral Air Force Base. I forgot how to take off in this plane. Thank you. Shit. Please. Please refrain from braking. Okay. So this is a plane I called High Flyer 1 because it can fly to very high altitude. It can actually fly to an altitude of somewhere around 40 kilometers, which is about 100,000 feet. Well, it's far more than 100,000 feet, but that's not important right now. I should probably also put the landing gear in because apparently I don't have the GPWS here to remind me of that. And how the fuck does this work? Anyway, get rid of that shit. So here you can see the autopilot that I have mentioned having before. So I am basically going to configure this real quick to hold 280 meters per second in a climb. My UI is kind of fucked up right now because I was trying to adjust it for my new 4K display, which I haven't actually played Kerbal Space Program on this display ever, including on this save. So it's yeah, I kind of need to fix the UI, but that involves reopening Kerbal Space Program, and I don't feel like doing that. So what I'm going to do here is have the cruise control take me up to 22,000 meters, holding 280-ish meters per second. And what we're going to do is look at this number here, which is the drag, and this number here, which is the lift. So basically, lift is the amount of force that we are generating pushing us away from the ground. So in order for us to sustain level flight, our lift must equal the amount of force being produced by gravity. In order for us to climb, we must produce more lift than we are producing by gravity, plus or minus the amount of thrust that we're producing. So as we go up in altitude, in order to sustain level flight, we must fly at a slightly higher velocity, because there is less air producing lift to hold us up. But there is a lot less air pushing back on us to produce drag. And the way the math works out is that lift decreases more slowly than drag does as we go up in altitude. Therefore, increasing altitude and then increasing velocity enough to sustain level flight ends up with a situation where we require less thrust to counter the amount of drag required to keep the same amount of lift to keep us level. And because of that, our engines don't have to work as hard to keep us from falling out of the sky. And while there is some effect to be talked about with the colder air at higher elevation producing more efficient output from a jet engine, and that's why we see the mass flow numbers in our Kerbal Space Program going down faster than we see the thrust going down, the biggest factor that makes flying at higher altitude more efficient is simply that at a higher altitude we get less drag, sustaining the same sort of flight condition. You can see this happening on screen. If you look at the numbers in Fair Aerospace, you can see that we are maintaining relatively similar lift numbers as I change the rates of climb, but our amount of drag is decreasing as we are holding similar amounts of velocity going up in altitude. It's also notable that as a plane gets heavier, its service ceiling decreases. An aircraft that isn't carrying passengers is probably going to be able to go a lot higher than an aircraft that has passengers, food and water for the passengers, and all of their luggage, and so on and so forth. A jet that has a full tank of fuel is also going to have a harder time holding a higher altitude than a jet that doesn't. Now, as you can see, I'm kind of almost maxing out the deflection limits on the elevators. And I am maxing out the throttle on the Klimovs, so this is pretty close to the service ceiling in level flight for this aircraft. I mean, our vertical speed is pretty high. We're at 33 feet per second, more or less. But we are going to see that rapidly start to go down now that we're pretty much out of ways to keep making it go up. So, I'm just going to pull the aircraft up a little bit more and then enable the T-45. Now this is going to make the aircraft kind of lose control a little bit, but using the T-45, we are no longer dependent on air, and we can go much higher. Apparently I have to test this through the staging sequence, so... Oh, yes. I also forgot that we have to stop. That's going to be inconvenient. Ha! I guess I'm going to have to fix that. It appears Jeremiah is running out of power. So that nuclear reactor is not doing its job. Speaking of Jeremiah, we've passed him a way long time ago. Yeah, this plane is actually going pretty far out. Now I'm just trying to bleed off speed. We're probably actually going to stall this thing, but that's okay. And actually, I'm going to, now that we're subsonic, deploy the spoilers and the flaps and the landing leg. Try to get as much drag as I can to slow us down. And you can really see the plane wanting to nose down. Yeah, and stalls when I pitch it up. We've also got a little bit of side slip. Shut up. Going on. Yes, I did tell a ground position warning system to shut up. It is annoying me, therefore it should shut up. Oh. And here we can begin to see my ineptitude as a pilot start to take place as we enter a spin. Yes. The good thing about spins is that they tend to bleed off a lot of speed, but we are losing altitude very quickly. So I guess this flight is going to be a failure. Let's see. Can I recover using the power of the T-45? I'm getting some serious mock tuck here, but we can just about pull out and return to level flight. So, now that we are completely out of fuel for the T-45, there is absolutely no chance that we're going to be able to reach 11 kilometers, especially if I don't turn the brakes off. So we're going to have to kind of, well, not even kind of, we're going to have to fly this whole thing again, or a different vehicle to test that parachute. But that's alright, because we finished our contract to test the Klimov. And we learned things today, and everybody knows that's what's important. I'm just going to try to fly this thing back to Kerbal Space Center, basically because we get better money back if we're closer to the Space Center. It costs us less money to send somebody out to pick this thing up and drag it home. And anyway, it gives us more time to experience flying an aircraft. And if I simulate a landing pass or two, I might be able to get the GPWS to yell at me more for content. Actually, there are some nice mountains past the Space Center, so I don't think our fuel will hold out until then, but if it does, perhaps I'll go try to crash into them, or just barely avoid doing so, and listen to the GPWS telling me to pull up. I appreciate how inaccurate these counts are. I don't really know why it's doing this, but yeah, that may be a design oversight on my part. Something is consuming food and electricity at a rate greater than expected. On the other hand, that nuclear reactor on the correctional facility had 5 times the required output, so who knows? Perhaps it's simply not throttling properly. Huh. We have actually deviated a lot further north than I thought we did. Probably during all of those stalls. I'll have to revisit the video. But I'm going to try to turn a little bit south and again try to get closer. There's also the island runway. My experience landing there is slim, mainly because the runway is even worse than the one at Kerbal Space Center. For the record, the one at Kerbal Space Center is extremely bad, because at least until you've upgraded it to Tier 3, the runway is actually bumpier than the grass immediately surrounding the Space Center. In previous versions, when the wheel colliders didn't handle bumpiness nearly as well, what we would do to take off from the Kerbal Space Center is taxi off the runway to the grass, line up on the grass, and then take off from the grass. And of course, to land at Kerbal Space Center, one would land on the grass and then taxi back up to the runway. Luckily, modern Unity's wheel colliders are a little bit better than that, so they can handle a variety of situations we couldn't handle before. And anyway, we have now run out of fuel. So however far we get is where we're going to go. Now, I am going to be landing this on parachutes for obvious reasons relating to the fact that we're not going to get anywhere close to the runway, and also I'm a terrible pilot, so I probably can't land this on the runway. And of course, the GPWS is not going to understand that I am landing under parachutes because it thinks that we're landing like a plane. Because we're a plane. Which is going to have the result that we're going to get all sorts of interesting warnings out of it. And hopefully you will get to enjoy that. Oh! We have broken the land distance record of 100 kilometers. Excellent. We get paid a little bit of money for that. Now, it's not exactly obvious from just watching the flight, but in the last 17 minutes, we've actually gone pretty far. We went from the Space Center all the way out, and we were almost at this little island, if you remember. And we're now just coming back. So this was actually a fairly successful flight in that regard, even though we didn't quite reach the altitude I wanted to. Now, an aerospace engineer would probably note that there are a number of ways we could improve this little plane to get further. First of all, we could get rid of this silly rocket engine and replace it with, well, another jet engine, or more fuel, or an empty tube, or really literally anything. This jet engine is pretty heavy, and all of the fuel for it is really heavy, and that's really the source of most of our problems. We could also stop doing this with all of these reaction wheels, but they're kind of necessary because all of these landing gear and the strange design of the aircraft, and we generally need those in order to stay level. The fact that we land on a parachute that isn't perfectly balanced, probably, also doesn't help. I don't mean that in that it probably doesn't help that we're going to land imbalanced. I mean it that I seriously doubt that I did the parachutes right, haven't tested it. The reaction wheels are going to help us land roughly flat, which is roughly how we want to land. I mean, in theory, we want to land a little bit nose up, because landing nose up is probably what saved us in that simulation of what happens when you try to take off with a single aileron. See, if it was crashing into rock, I would call it litho braking. Litho for rock, braking for, well, braking. I don't know if I can still use that when we crash into water. Perhaps it should be hydro braking. But anyway, hydro braking using the rest of the airplane as a sacrifice is probably going to help Valentina's chance of survival if we were to do that. Now we are actually lined up with KSC here. Oh, well, there goes that. I was going to try to turn, but because I was stupid and didn't use the rudder, we get to listen to this instead. For the record, that's the stall warning. That is simulating the sound of a stick shaker, of course. But yes, you can see we're landing very nose up. If we were landing on the ground, I would try harder to land like this on the wheels. Or, for that matter, like this.
1,000.
Thank you for the altitude call out, co-pilot. Since we're landing in the water, I'm comfortable landing a little bit nose up. Or very nose up, for that matter. Okay, perhaps these parachutes will require more dampening. Or, perhaps I should say this is on purpose. And simply make sure next time that this parachute auto-cuts low like it already does. It appears that I am smarter than I thought. Alright. Let's turn off the stall warning. And let's fast forward time a little bit to get through to the point where we actually, well, do something.
Approaching minimums.
Yes, we are approaching minimums. Minimums refer to the minimum decision altitude when we no longer have the altitude to abort a landing, in theory. Of course, there are many situations where you want to abort a landing after reaching minimums, but in this situation we can't abort the landing anyway,
Minimums.
since we are landing on parachutes and have 2 meters per second of velocity. If these parachutes were cut, we don't have the altitude to dive, recover from this stall that we're currently in, and then pull up. And then we would have to ditch in the water. Now, in Kerbal's space program, water is actually a lot harder to land in than it is on, well, Earth. I'm turning off SAS to save a little bit of power because we're running out. On Earth, water is pretty nasty for a plane to land in. In Kerbal's space program, trying to land at speed in water is actually suicidal. I mean, Valentina
100.
survived our simulation attempt, but I seriously doubt that that would actually work. I definitely wouldn't rely on it. I also appreciate that this thing says food depleted even though we have an hour of food.
50.
It also informs us that the windows are open, even though I very
40.
much doubt that the windows are open at the bottom of the
30.
sea.
20.
Retard.
Thank you.
Retard.
Yes, I appreciate it.
Retard.
I am stupid, yes.
Retard.
And we have landed. For the record, that call out is retard, not retard. It is saying retard your vertical speed, meaning flare, not calling the pilot a retard, which would be politically incorrect, and in general not particularly polite. Now, it seems that these mystery goo have been absolutely worthless because the only place I went that they're very useful was the runway. So we'll just collect 3 science from that. And before the waves manage to destroy this thing, let's recover. And from that relative success of a flight, we have gained 11 science, we have recovered most of the money we needed to fly, and of course, Val is now a somewhat certified aircraft pilot. Now, we are going to go off and check what the heck is going on with the JKCF. And the power immediately restores and comes up. Yes, it seems that this hibernation system is conflicting with something. As soon as we enable hibernation, it's going to leave power when it's deloaded. And apparently what that means is that hibernation is going to run us out of power because it's not automatically adjusting power requirements. Who knew? So leaving that off, we can start to address the food issue. The greenhouse really should be producing food, so it's questionable that it isn't. I shall have to examine that. Ah, yes. The problem is, of course, that we do not have enough wastewater. We should be able to get plenty of that from the sea. But of course, that is an issue to be remedied at a later time. Well, hello there. I bet you didn't expect to see this. This is not good. To be honest, I'm not sure how the drone can do that.